There are things that happen inside an online English classroom that nobody in this industry talks about publicly. Everyone posts the heartwarming moments. The student who finally nailed a difficult pronunciation after weeks of trying. The elderly gentleman who wanted to practice English so he could speak to his grandchildren studying abroad. The shy teenager who blossomed into a confident speaker after a few months of consistent lessons. Those stories are real, and they are genuinely wonderful. But they are not the whole picture. Not even close. I have been teaching English online for years. I work with students from Japan and other parts of Asia, and I have had thousands of conversations across all kinds of topics, all kinds of personalities, and all kinds of situations. Most of my students are wonderful people, genuinely. But some of them have made me question my patience, my professionalism, and occasionally my will to open my laptop in the morning. And since this channel is called what it is called, I think it is time to say the things out loud that most teachers keep buried somewhere between their lesson notes and their silent frustration. This is not a rant against students as a whole. This is an honest look at the behaviors, patterns, and dynamics that ESL teachers experience regularly but almost never discuss publicly because the industry expects us to smile, stay positive, and pretend every class is a joy. Some classes are not a joy, and pretending otherwise does not help anyone. Let us start with the student who books a lesson with zero intention of actually putting in any effort. You know this type. They show up, they are polite enough in the beginning, but within the first few minutes it becomes very clear that they are not really there to learn. They give one-word answers. They look off-screen constantly. They agree with everything you say, without actually processing it. They are physically present in the lesson room, but mentally somewhere else entirely. Maybe they are at work and thought they could squeeze in an English lesson between tasks. Maybe they booked the class because they felt guilty about not studying and figured showing up was enough. Maybe they just wanted to spend 25 minutes with someone who would talk at them without demanding much in return. This is more common than most teachers will admit. And the frustrating part is not just the wasted class time. It is that these students sometimes still leave a rating afterward, and that rating does not always reflect the fact that they were the ones who showed up unprepared and disengaged. A teacher can pour genuine energy into a class and still end up on the receiving end of a low score because the student did not get what they were hoping for, even though what they were hoping for was never something a 25-minute class could realistically provide. Then there is the opposite problem. The student who arrives with expectations so high that no teacher on the planet could meet them within the constraints of a single session. These students want transformation. They want to sound fluent by the end of the lesson. They want you to fix every grammatical error, give detailed written feedback in the chat simultaneously, while also having a natural flowing conversation, respond to their preferred topics regardless of what was originally booked, and do all of this with the energy of someone who just had their best day ever, even if you are on your 6th consecutive class with a sore throat and a canker sore on your tongue. I am not exaggerating. I have lived every single item on that list at least once. The entitlement that sometimes comes with paying for a service is something no one in this industry prepares you for. There is a specific kind of student who, because they are paying for the session, believes they have purchased not just your time and expertise, but also your unconditional deference. They want you to agree with their opinions, validate every word they say, and never, under any circumstances, introduce friction or correction into the conversation. If you gently point out a recurring grammar mistake, they get defensive. If you steer the conversation to cover the lesson material they booked, they act like you are being unhelpful. If you bring honest, natural energy to the class instead of performing cheerfulness, they describe you as unfriendly in their feedback. Here is the truth that most teachers are afraid to say. Honest, natural conversation is harder to find than performed friendliness. Any teacher can smile on command and agree with everything a student says. That is not teaching. That is customer service theater. Real teaching sometimes involves telling someone they made a mistake. It sometimes involves redirecting a conversation that has gone off track. It sometimes involves holding a standard that the student finds uncomfortable. The teachers who do this well are actually the better ones, even if they are not always the most popular ones. Let me talk about the show-off student because this is a category that deserves its own paragraph. This is the student who arrives to the lesson not to learn, but to perform. They want to demonstrate how good their English already is. They bring complicated news articles, drop advanced vocabulary into the conversation, and steer every discussion toward topics where they can appear knowledgeable and impressive. This sounds harmless until you realize that somewhere in the middle of their performance, they will ask you what the synonym for a very basic word is. A word that any intermediate learner should already know. And suddenly the whole facade cracks a little, because the advanced vocabulary was assembled for the occasion, but the foundation underneath it is shakier than they wanted you to see. The reason this behavior happens is not difficult to understand. A lot of adult learners are deeply self-conscious about their English level. They have been studying for years, maybe decades, and they feel embarrassed that they still need lessons. So they compensate by coming in with armor. The complex vocabulary, the confident posture, the carefully chosen topics are all a way of saying, please do not think I am a beginner. Please see me as someone who is almost there. The tragedy is that this defensiveness is exactly what prevents them from actually improving. You cannot fill a cup that is always trying to look full. Now I want to talk about something that is more serious and that I genuinely struggled with how to frame honestly without being unfair. Some students use their lesson time in ways that feel less like language learning and more like an attempt to get emotional labor for free. There are students who want to talk about their problems, their difficult marriage, their workplace stress, their loneliness, their regrets. Sometimes this happens naturally and genuinely within the context of a conversation, and those moments can actually be some of the most meaningful classes because real human connection and real language use happen simultaneously. But there is a different version of this, where the student essentially wants a therapist and is using the language lesson format as a way to access that without paying for actual therapy. The dynamic becomes uncomfortable when the teacher, who is not trained as a counselor and is being paid for language instruction, has to navigate a student's emotional needs carefully enough to avoid making things worse, while also gently steering the conversation back towards something resembling the actual lesson. This is an invisible labor that teachers carry and almost never talk about. It takes real emotional intelligence to manage well, and it is completely unpaid. Speaking of invisible labor, let us talk about lesson notes. In many online English teaching setups, teachers are expected to provide written feedback or a summary after each class. This sounds reasonable in principle. A few sentences about what was covered, maybe a note on vocabulary or expressions used, something the student can review later. In practice, the expectation has crept far beyond that for some students. They want detailed written corrections of everything they said during the class. They want grammar explanations. They want personalized vocabulary lists. They want all of this written perfectly and submitted quickly, and they want it on top of having delivered an engaging, energetic, fully present 25-minute lesson immediately before. The math on this does not work. If a teacher is expected to provide 10 minutes of detailed written feedback per class, and they're doing multiple classes in a row, the unpaid work adds up very quickly. And yet, if the notes are too brief, some students will mention it in their feedback as a negative. The teacher ends up in an impossible position where the quality bar for what is technically outside the paid class time keeps moving. There is also the issue of students who are simply rude, and I think it needs to be said directly. Rudeness in an online classroom sometimes looks like what you would expect. Short, dismissive responses. Talking over the teacher. Logging off without saying anything when the class ends. But it also shows up in subtler ways. Students who comment on the teacher's appearance, background, or accent in ways that are not compliments. Students who ask intrusive personal questions and seem put out when the teacher redirects professionally. Students who are visibly distracted by their phones or other screens throughout the entire class and then seem surprised at the end that they did not feel they got value from the session. And then there is the cultural layer, which I want to address carefully because it is real and it matters. Teaching students from specific cultural backgrounds comes with specific dynamics that no one really prepares you for. In some cultures, disagreeing with a teacher or admitting confusion is seen as disrespectful, which means a student will nod and say they understand when they absolutely do not, and both of you waste the rest of the class building on a foundation of misunderstanding. In other cultures, directness from a teacher is experienced as harshness, even when it is completely professional and well-intentioned. And in some cases, there are students who hold certain assumptions about teachers from specific countries, including assumptions about competence, authority, or professionalism that are based on bias rather than anything the teacher has actually done. Navigating all of this while staying professional, staying warm, delivering an actually useful lesson, managing your own energy across multiple sessions, and dealing with the administrative side of the work is genuinely demanding. It is work that requires high emotional intelligence, real language expertise, cultural awareness, patience, and the ability to think on your feet. None of that is reflected in what the job is sometimes publicly described as, which is basically just chatting with people in English. Here is what I want people who have never done this work to understand. Online English teaching is a real skill. The best teachers in this space are genuinely talented at what they do. They have learned how to read a student within the first few minutes of a class. They know how to adjust their energy, their vocabulary, their pacing, and their approach in real time based on who is sitting across from them on the screen. They can turn an awkward silence into a productive conversation moment. They can redirect a derailing student without making them feel embarrassed. They can deliver honest feedback in a way that motivates rather than discourages. These are not small things. And they deserve to be talked about honestly, including the parts that are hard. Thanks for watching. If you found this helpful, subscribe to help me hit my 2,000 video goal. This is my unfiltered diary of solo living in the Philippines, from the tough days in the ESL classroom to my journey learning Japanese and Korean. Yes, I am still a beginner. If you would like to support my work and my retirement fund, check out the Buy a Treat for My Pets link in the description. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the next update. Thanks for being part of the journey. See you then.